Okay, so what I want to go through today is a little bit of discussion around some of the high level principles and important things to bear in mind as you approach level design as a discipline. So, to start off, I'm going to talk a bit about like the level designer, what they do, and kind of qualities and attributes that are maybe useful and things that if you're really interested in doing level design and maybe focusing on that as a discipline, they're the kind of things you might want to look into. Then we'll talk a bit about teaching the player, which is kind of a key skill in level design, like thinking about tutorial spaces and introducing new mechanics and gameplay ingredients. Then talking broadly about designing spaces, the kind of considerations you might give to the way you lay out spaces and what you have in those spaces. And then guiding players basically. So thinking about how you show a player different things in a level. Um, so there might be this is beyond, let's say, tutorializing, but rather trying to encourage a player to look at things you think are interesting or that might point them in the direction that you hope they're going to go in the game. And then obviously Q&A. So to start off with the level designer themselves. So some of the key aspects of being a level designer, it's very similar to if we think of game designers as being focused on creating compelling gameplay and compelling gameplay experiences. The level designer is kind of there to distill the idea of the game and the experiences that it is hoped the game will create, and to create a space in which those experiences can happen, basically. So it's a way of translating, oh, there's all these cool mechanics, but how do we create an environment and a space and a an area the player can interact with these mechanics and kind of experience the game as the game designer might hope they would. There's also a big overlap with game design. So like sometimes bad level design can impact game design, and similarly bad game design can have a huge impact on level design. So often level designers will have some good understanding generally of game design, and game designers will have some level of understanding of game designers will understand level design to some degree as well. But that kind of does depend as well, because often, I think I've probably mentioned this a few times already, but like game design and game studios are what we'd call heterogeneous in terms of like they're all quite different. Each studio has different practices and different things they do and don't do, and ways that the games are made, and ways that I suppose, like, you might be a level designer, let's say at Larian, okay, and this may be a simple example, working on like Baldur's Gate, and there you're creating like levels for this big over like kind of open world narrative sort of RPG type game. And it's a top down perspective, and your role is very much to maybe do all the scripting and things like that of the missions. Then someone else might be a level designer working in Ubisoft, working on like the next Assassin's Creed game, and that job might focus very much on designing a specific room or specific rooms within a given environment. And in Ubisoft, you'll probably not just have level designers, but you'll have like world designers who are designing like the open world spaces and the kind of flow between them and stuff. So, and like you might work in an indie studio where there's one designer, so that's game designer and level designer and everything else designer, basically. So bear in mind that these things are kind of, these are broad principles, but if you understand what the discipline involves and you understand the principles of the discipline, you can apply those. You can hopefully either scale those up to be like working on a large team where you do a small part, or you can scale them down where you work on a small team and you do a little bit of everything, basically. So it allows you hopefully kind of adapt your expertise a little bit. And a key aspect, as I kind of mentioned at the start, is this merging of the spatial elements with the mechanical. So it's that you're taking the space and the environment in which the player exists, and you're trying to think of how does this environment showcase and how does it highlight the mechanics that the game has within it. So oftentimes it might be like, designing encounters that encourage the player to use different tools maybe they have at their disposal. So as I mentioned on the last slide, there's kind of, to say that there's just two disciplines is maybe not quite true, because there's also like environmental art and there's level scripting and stuff like that. But if we think of like level design as a discipline, often like pure level design kind of focus in one of two areas, and one is world design and the other is level design. So world is like you're designing a world to explore. Level design is much more about designing a level to complete. I suppose one way to think about this is like the the level designer is almost like an architect, like creating a very specific space with very detailed design areas for the player to interact with. And the world designer is much more like a almost like a landscaper or something like that. You know, you're creating the entire environment in which the game will take place, and you're often less concerned with specific like micro details so much as like the flow and kind of making sure the world is interesting. Um, and world design, I suppose one thing that makes it quite different to level design is often about like challenges and encounters and kind of focused on second to second how you move through a space, what you're going to encounter, maybe if there's puzzles, things like that are all part of level design. World design usually isn't so much about challenge, it's more about flow, and how the level flows, what it feels like to travel, what sort of areas the world pulls you in. So, like, if anyone has played Breath of the Wild, a lot of that game is really much more world design as opposed to level design. And the world design kind of it encourages you to explore different areas, and you see something off in the distance and you go, oh, that's cool, I want to head over there. And that's kind of world design working quite well. Level design in that game might be the design of the shrines where there's different puzzle challenges and things like that, and the rooms are laid out in specific ways, and you're trying to kind of solve that puzzle. And that's kind of puzzle level design, but broadly speaking, that's the differentiation between the two of them. So again, yeah, Breath of the Wild is kind of a classic example of world design. And you play the game and you look at these expanses and you go, oh, cool, there's like a thing off there to the left that I want to go and explore and see what that is. There's this like overhang over here. Oh, that's cool, I want to head there. What about this mountain? And the great thing about Breath of the Wild is you head off in a direction, you explore something, and you find something. Often you find something interesting there, basically. So that's what world design is. It's trying to encourage the player to explore the world of the game, and really, it really only applies in open world games. If you're making a game like Call of Duty or something like that, the concept of world design doesn't really exist to the same degree unless there's an open world Call of Duty I'm forgetting about. But those games are much more like linear level sort of focused. And then level design is the kind of things you'd see in games like Titanfall 2. Okay, and these are levels with specific layouts and encounters and challenges that you're going to find in specific areas. Okay, so things are very level design is very like micro detail focused. So a lot of things will be about like the placement of this, where the enemies are in relation to this, like kind of zip line rope and that sort of thing. Kind of, let's say, even how high the ceiling is versus how high the character can jump and stuff like that are kind of key considerations often in like the very specific field of level design. So I suppose some background that can be useful when you're designing levels. It really helps to know the genre and to be familiar with player expectations. It is much easier to design first person shooter levels if you play a lot of first person shooters, because you have that experience and that background and that understanding. And that is kind of like, it's quite difficult to, let's say, if you normally play strategy games and then you're asked to develop a level for Call of Duty or something like that, you're going to struggle because you're maybe not too familiar with the type of game and the norms of level design and the kind of ways level design can be effective in that space. So if you are making a game, and for the games you're working on for your final project, I'd recommend trying to play games that exist in a similar space in terms of level design, and try and like take notes as you play those games and take notes of the kind of things they're doing with the level design. What way are they laying out their spaces? What way are they thinking about how people interact with this world? Another thing that's kind of, it's almost crucial, is like a background in some degree of architecture can be quite important. And this isn't that like you have to have a degree in architecture, but even like even knowing like Frank Lloyd Wright or Mies van der Rohe or whoever it might be, different like kind of influential architects, and understanding different periods and types of architecture you might see around helps create more believable level design. So you might think, okay, I'm going to create an environment, and it's going to be kind of a Georgian sort of street that I'm going to be walking in and exploring. If you understand architecture, or like if you're at least willing to do the research to find out what that style of architecture is, you create a much more believable Georgian scene than someone who goes, okay, this is like I'm going to make this old looking. And, they're trying to make something look old, but they don't really know what the references are or what exactly they're trying to do. So sometimes having that background and that knowledge can be a useful thing to draw on and to pull from there. Then another thing is like focus. So you really focus on level, layout, gameplay elements, mechanics, ingredients. Gameplay elements, mechanics, ingredients basically all mean the same thing. Ubisoft tend to use the term ingredients for their level design because they think of their open world games as often just being like an interesting encounter is a recipe built on ingredients basically. And most studios will tend to mention like mechanics or gameplay elements, but you focus a lot on level layout and gameplay. They're kind of key things. So creating a space that's like 100% realistic might not create interesting gameplay. Creating a space that has really compelling gameplay might not be really interesting mechanically, or might not be really interesting from a architectural space, or it might pull the player out of the experience because things clearly aren't the right scale. Um, Think of adding difficulty progression to your levels, but keep in mind the need for pacing and breathing room for the player. Okay, so generally what you want is a nice difficulty curve on your level. So you want to think about maybe starting off, and you maybe want to have some action normally at the start of the level and having your player feel kind of engaged with the game and the mechanics. Often after this initial action, you want to have things kind of die off a little so that the player has some breathing room, a chance to figure out and experience the world of the game before then building up in like kind of waves of kind of excitement or action in your game before crescendoing at like a sort of peak of the level. Like the most interesting part of your level probably should come towards the end. Like that should be the sort of the climax of the level basically happens at that point. And then yeah, having a downbeat of easier gameplay and spikes of difficulty is good for pacing. What isn't good for pacing is like constantly ramping up the difficulty or the excitement or the number of enemies. Actually, having this sort of ebb and flow of gameplay and difficulty is really good because it allows the player kind of build their model of what the game is, have some breathing room, and then kind of build on it again. Another thing is playtesting is really essential. Even more so, I would say, almost in game design, playtesting is essential for level design. So always try and involve playtesters as early as and as often as possible. You want to get people playing through the space so you can find out what's going wrong pretty quickly. Because as a level designer in your head, you'll have kind of like, oh cool, the way you play this level is you go to place X, Y, and Z, and that's it. But for your players, often what they're going to do when they play the game is they're going to start off and they're going to go in the opposite direction to what you thought they would do. They're going to walk into a wall and not know what to do. They're going to miss the pickup you thought was really clear. They're going to not read the text that tells them what they need to do. And all these things are really important because you learn, okay, players aren't seeing this stuff. What do I need to change? How do I need to tweak this level? Another thing is yeah, thinking about the sort of purpose of a space. So this goes back to sort of the architectural background that can sometimes be useful. So what would normal inhabitants of the space do there? So if you're creating a space station, think about like, well, what are people doing on the space station? What are the sort of spaces you might have on that? There's this kind of semi-classic level design question, which is like, where is the toilet? Okay, and this is like if you've got a game set with like people around, there should be toilets somewhere because people need to use the toilet, and it's often a sign of like good level design because what you see is they've thought of what the spaces are and how someone might use them, and it means they've given a lot of detail and a lot of consideration for how exactly the level design is going to work and how it's going to flow and what details might pull someone out of the space. Like if you were creating a level set in an office building and there was no toilet in the entire building, some players wouldn't notice that, but the players who do notice it, it would actually pull them out of the experience. So having that attention to detail and that sort of focus is really important. And this goes back to like always having a reason for your choices. why did you pick a room for a certain purpose? So you might have, let's say, a room where the crew relax on the spaceship. So you probably want to think about that as being like a pretty central space on the ship. And then you might want to think about like why are the objects placed in a certain way? And sorry for the typo there, but why are the objects placed in a certain way? So again, why might, let's say, in that kind of rec room space on the spaceship, if you create that space and everything's neat and tidy and orderly, it creates a sense of this is maybe a new spaceship that's never been inhabited, or like it's kind of pristine. If you have everything like kind of knocked over and messy and there's like cans on the ground and stuff like that and crisps lying everywhere, you kind of go, okay, there was like a party here or something like that. And it creates a different sense of what the space is. And there are different reasons for doing those two things, but understanding why you would do one and why the space is left one way versus the other is really important. Um, and where there are interactions, try and ensure this is kind of this is, I suppose, more so maybe a tip than purpose specifically. But if you're having something like a door that opens or a puzzle that the player is trying to solve, try and ensure that the player can see a response to their action. So if you're maybe trying to solve or like unlock a door or something like that by pressing a sequence of buttons in the right order, what you probably want to make sure is that once the player gets that sequence right, it's quite clear to the player, firstly, that they got the sequence right, and secondly, the consequence of getting that sequence right. So you might want to have, let's say, something where a player's opening that door, or maybe like they're opening an airlock or something like that. Have the player looking out a window staring at the airlock as they input this code, and as soon as they get the code right, the airlock like jettisons out into space and they can see it straight away and they see, okay, cool, I did do that. There's nothing worse in a game than being like, you do something, you don't know if it's done anything, you're not sure, you press it again, you press it a few times, you're not sure what it's doing, and you wander around and you don't make that connection between your action and the consequence of that action. um yeah, so this is very much that toilet problem. There's a good blog post here I've linked to down there. This guy has a podcast that, if you're interested in level design, is quite interesting to listen to. He interviews a lot of different level designers. um but again, that idea of like where's the toilet, and it has to do with all like the detail of level design basically. So then the next thing to think about is kind of teaching the player, and how we teach the player our game and how we teach them to understand our game and interact with the spaces in our game. So tutorial spaces are very common in games and they're kind of crucial. Often games are quite complex. If you've ever tried to teach someone, or if you've ever looked at someone try and play a game if they don't play games, and try and use like a modern controller with its thumbsticks and its shoulder buttons and stuff like that, people can often struggle quite a bit to play games because there can be a lot going on. One of the things is, if you're designing a tutorial space for a game, generally the advice would be, even if it's an open world game, to start off having quite a linear tutorial area. And the reason for that is you kind of want to make sure that the player learns how to play the game before opening up the world of the game. So again, even in Breath of the Wild, the tutorial area is like the small sort of, I think it's like a plateau or something like that, if I remember it right, where you're kind of stuck there until you complete all the tutorial things, and then you can move on into the complete open world game. And the reason for that is they want to make sure that you understand the mechanics of the game before you head off trying to do things without kind of knowing exactly how to play. Um, Generally, like the goal of a tutorial is to teach something, so you're trying to make sure that your players are learning something by playing. And unless you're teaching them about like how to make choices, or like teaching them about the open world in some way, try to stick to like some sort of linear corridor or something that sends people in very clear directions. I'm using the word corridor there, but like what I mean there is like a linear progression. It doesn't necessarily have to be a corridor. It can be like a street or an area or things like that are quite clearly demarked in terms of progress through the space. Um, the other thing is, try to be quite lenient in the design of challenges early on, and build the challenge after the player gets to grips with the game. You don't want to have an extremely difficult challenge generally at the start of your game, You want to kind of start off, be fairly easy on the player, and once they've got a grasp of the systems and the gameplay, you then build challenge on top of that. There's a few caveats to this. So if anyone has played like the Souls games, they often tend to push challenge even quite early on. In fact, I remember when playing Bloodborne, I think you wake up and there's like these dogs in front of you. Um, or like, are they wolves or something? I can't remember exactly. And like, you've no weapons or anything like that. And I remember it was Bloodborne's the first Souls games I played, but you wake up and basically all I was trying to do was fight these wolves basically barehanded. And like, it took me ages. I was like, oh my god, these Souls games are so hard. These are impossible. Until I realized I'd missed like a tutorial prompt to say about like, oh, if you go to a place in the game, then you get some gear, and then that fight became would be much easier. But I hadn't realized that that was a thing I could do. So be conscious of the level of challenge you have as well. Like players will expect it in certain games, but in general, as a rule of thumb, start off easy, then build a challenge after that. Now, another key thing with tutorials and teaching the player is introducing mechanics. So when you introduce something new to the player, let the players play with it, then build on it with other mechanics or challenges. Okay, so basically what you want to do is kind of have you show someone how to do something, and then you let the player play with it, and then they're going to build their mastery of it. Okay, so the whole idea here is that like you're not just like, oh, here's how you wall run in this game. No, wall run for 5 minutes across these pits of fire or something like that. And if you die, you go back to the very start. That's probably not very fun for players to do. So again, it's play with, build on challenges, and then you know have extra mechanics come into play. And this is very much the Nintendo way of introducing their kind of mechanics or their ingredients. And at the start, you learn what it is. You then get some time to play around with it. And through your time with the game, you get the chance to master it. So you get to really understand what the system is. And if this sounds similar to some of the things we talk about, like with game design and system design, it very much is in that sort of space of, learn, introduce things, play around with them, and master them. So once we move on from tutorializing our space and teaching the players the sort of basics, there's a few concerns we want to take into account as we think about designing spaces. So in terms of process, don't be afraid of whiteboxing to create a layout. A lot of novice designers and junior designers tend to think like, oh well, instead of whiteboxing, I'm going to go to the Unity asset store and I'm going to get like these assets that look really cool, and I'm going to put them in my scene, and my scene's going to look great. The problem is the scene might look great. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, even when you do that. But even though the scene looks great, the problem is that the gameplay isn't there and the level isn't good. And next thing someone plays it and they play test it and they like don't know what's going on in the level, or they don't know where to go or what they should be doing, and you have to make a change to the level design. And like that Unity asset pack you downloaded doesn't maybe have a corner piece that you need to design this level the way you actually want to do it. So you're ending up with your level design being compromised pretty early on. So instead, I would say when you're starting out level designing, just use Pro Builder, build out and block out spaces in white box that the player can move around and explore. If you're doing this for 2D games, just do it with like simple, white box cubes and slopes and stuff like that. Just very simple things. It's and like the crazy thing is, if you ever talk to level designers about white boxes, they actually love them. Like, as in, they think these are the most beautiful things in the world. A nice white box to a level designer is amazing to them. So don't worry about someone thinking, oh, well, like this looks crap, or, it's not the way things are done. If you were working in a studio, this is the way it would be done. It would be white boxing. No one would move on to doing detailed art until the layouts were kind of much more finalized, basically, because there's a huge cost in terms of creating the detailed layouts. And if you have a detailed layout and then you start moving things, it kind of creates even more cost and consequences and stuff. And yeah, so basically it's just way faster to iterate on, and it's just standard. Like it has a beauty to level designers and stuff. And like this is kind of how you might see some white box looking at studios. And this would be like as a white box becomes slightly more evolved. But the level designer will basically create like the walkable spaces, and then environmental assets might start creating like, oh well, here's some generic lampposts we can start to put in. Here's some buildings we can use for the background. And that's all fine. These are like quick block out meshes that they're doing. This probably takes an asset designer like maybe 20 minutes to create this. This down here might be 40 minutes. And it helps create a sense of the space without being a huge time investment. In a couple of days, a team would have a level of this quality set up and running, and you're able to explore what the space will feel like without a huge time or resource investment. Obviously, you don't have that size team and stuff, so creating a simpler blockout that's just like cubes and boxes is totally fine as well. And you still see that even in big studios, often at the very start when it's just a level designer working on a project. That's the way the scenes will look as well. So when you're designing these spaces, another thing you need to think of is the concept of player freedom. So you need to be conscious of the design of too many corridors, as they often don't lend themselves to interesting level design. So if if you've ever been stuck in a global pandemic, you'll probably be familiar with the sense of like lacking freedom and how frustrating and annoying that can be. And if what you want to do is make a player feel like claustrophobic and like they've nowhere to go, or like kind of things are maybe quite dull or something like that, having lots of like corridors and combined spaces can be useful. But generally, as game designers, 9 times out of 10, we're working on games where we want our players to feel like freedom and to explore and stuff like that. Um, but most of the time, if we want that freedom, we like will try and avoid corridors. Okay, and it's a very, again, it's a novice thing to create level designs that are like just rooms connected together by corridors, and they can feel, there were certain games where you want it, like there are horror games and stuff like that, where having confined controlled spaces is kind of a key part of creating that experience. But there are other ways to do that as well. You can use darkness, you can use open spaces in horror games as well to create like this very eerie sense of not knowing what's around, and like not being able to see where there are walls or buildings can create similar experiences as well without relying on your player being stuck in kind of corridors all the time. And I think definitely after this pandemic is over, everyone will be glad to play games where like things are open and you can move around and stuff like that. So yeah, players in general, by and large, will tend to like to have freedom, and they love that sense of freedom and being free. So if you can, and if it's a type of game that supports it, try and design spaces that support players' ability to move around those spaces. So then, thinking about like the challenges that the player might encounter in a level, we often think about like checkpoints and what's going to happen. So try to have a fail safe to go back quickly to where the player was after failing a challenge. So a fail safe is slightly different to a checkpoint. A checkpoint is like, let's say I'm trying to do a jumping challenge and I failed the jumping challenge, I die, and I'm like checkpointed back to maybe the start of that section. A failsafe is I'm trying to do the jumping challenge, I fall down, and there's like maybe I land in the sewers and there's a ladder I can climb back out of to then get back on the platform to start the jumping challenge. Okay. Generally, most players will tend to prefer the failsafe option than the checkpoint option. Okay, and that's not like, sometimes you do need to use checkpoints, and like you do want those consequences that the player will die if they fail something. But oftentimes think about, does this challenge, does it require a checkpoint or does it require a failsafe? 9 times out of 10, you're better off with a failsafe than a checkpoint, unless you want something to be very high stakes, and then the checkpoint is kind of crucial. Otherwise, the failsafe is much more rewarding and feels much better for the player. Another thing that comes up a lot with novice designers is backtracking. So players will, like, I've often seen students design a game where it's like, oh, you're going to find key cards in a level. So you're going to like walk down a long corridor, walk into a room, you're going to search the room and you're going to find a key card in there. Then you're going to walk out of that room, back down the long corridor, find another long corridor with a room in it, and then you're going to go into that room, find another key card, and that's going to open the door you found at the start of the game. That's like kind of like I would say I've seen in my time as a lecturer over the last 10 years, I've probably seen somewhere in the region of 100 levels that follow that pattern basically. Instead, things to think about there is that, you maybe walk through a space or you walk through a house, you find a key card, you then walk out of that space and there's another like side stairs that you can, or maybe you're able to walk out like the back door of the house, walk around to another entrance to the house or something like that. So basically, that instead of having to go back down the way you came, it's generally better for players if they can loop back around to the start as opposed to being kind of walking back and forth along the same spaces can feel very repetitive. Um, and this is where you might add, let's say, even from what you might have is, let's say, you walk into, to try and give an example of this, you walk into a hall, there's a door in front of you, that door is locked. You have to find the key card. You go to like a room you go right down a corridor, you go into a room, you search that room, you find a key card, and that opens a door back into the main hall, basically, so that you're able to get back to the main hall with your key card without walking back down that corridor and stuff. So try and add loops and shortcuts to go past areas and provide more opportunity to use the design spaces. The corridors of your game maybe aren't that interesting, but what is interesting probably is like that hall with the door that the player wants to unlock. And by doing this, you can really focus in on those aspects of the game and make sure they're really good versus the player looking at like the wallpaper texture in the hall 50 times over. Unless you're making PT and then looking at the wallpaper in the hall 100 times over is actually kind of the game. But again, that's a very specific context for it. And yeah, always try and think about like reusing the space as much as possible. Try and think about how you can have a challenge, and at the end of that challenge, the player maybe comes back to a space and reuses that space, and maybe they find that space to be slightly different than it was before. Um, or even you'll often have it. Maybe you go into that hall, you go through, you manage to open that big door, you go through some fights and environments, and then you come out of a higher space and you're looking down at a balcony at that entrance hall where you came into this building. Those sort of perspectives, players are often like, oh cool, that's where I came in. I kind of understand the structure of this building a bit better. So having those kind of landmarks and things are really useful. Another thing that novice designers tend not to use too much is verticality. And it's a really useful design element, even in like if it's quite a linear level, like using stairs and ramps to add elevation and interest is kind of a crucial aspect. So instead of having everything on a single plane, like a single flat horizontal plane, think about how you might have stairs going up to a different level. A player does a challenge up there, they drop down, they maybe go underground, and like even though it's still a linear flow, it creates a much more interesting linear flow because the player's not just moving on a horizontal plane, they're moving up and down, and their perspective on the level changes a bit as well. And so like verticality is almost always better than a flat area. If you can create environments that use verticality and movement through a space, it's generally encouraged if you can do it. Then thinking about player movement, games focused on navigation. So like any 3D game, any FPS or third person game, there is this concept of metrics. And metrics are basically how far the player can jump, how high the player is, and then maybe how fast they run, that sort of thing. And design around these, design your doors to be 1.5 times the player height. And design your space around the metrics that you understand. Your player can maybe jump like 2 times player height, so then you design things that you can jump on based on that. Okay, so you're using the numbers and the metrics to design the level basically. And that's really important, especially like if you're working in a big studio like an Ubisoft or something like that. All their levels will be designed early on like graph paper, and they'll be using the metrics to define like how big should things be, how much space should we have here. Because what it does, it gives you a good first guess of what the level design should be. It probably won't be perfect, but it's a better first guess than if you were kind of making it up as you go along. And try to ensure geometry is smooth to navigate. Try to avoid awkward step heights or frustrating geometry. Frustrating geometry is things where like there's like a slight mismatch between the height of maybe two objects on a single plane, so there's a slight step and the player maybe gets slightly stuck or doesn't move properly. Awkward step heights is where maybe you have to jump onto each step as opposed to moving up it smoothly, up like moving up the stairs. So try and think about those things to avoid those sort of geometry frustrations. Try and have your geometry feel nice to move through. Again, unless you're doing something where the goal is to have geometry that is not nice to move through. Then some things of frustrating design, and these are things that can really just like, I suppose they're more so like tips or things to think about that like can really frustrate players in 3D games. So if you're creating a third person game or especially a first person game, try to avoid like 90-degree turns. So like if you're walking up the stairs and then it takes a complete right 90-degree turn, that's quite an awkward thing to do. So instead try and think of having the stairs as being a curved stairs or something like that. It The 90-degree turn often breaks the flow of movement. In the real world, in our real lives, we're pretty good at like walking upstairs and taking a smooth corner around the turn. In a game, because our field of view and our perspective is kind of a little more forward focused, we're not quite as good at taking that turn and seeing what's up there in terms of the challenge. Again, if you want to create an experience that's like tight and stressful, then you can go with that sort of thing, but it's not something you should always be doing. And then let the players breathe between chunks of gameplay. Okay, so if you have something that's quite challenging, make sure after the challenge you give the players a break, a chance to like lower the tempo, take in the game, do a couple of easy challenges before you ramp up difficulty again. Okay, so there's like frustration following frustration can get a player to quit pretty quickly. So sometimes players will accept a certain amount of frustration if it's then followed by a chance to get their breath and enjoy the game basically. And then another thing is, and this is advice I got from a level designer who's been over at TU Dublin a few times, um, is that like be really careful when designing a maze. So mazes can be really frustrating for players. There's nothing worse than like a completely random maze that players can't really move through, and that they struggle to kind of understand, okay, where am I trying to get to? I'm finding dead ends. Have I been down this way before? And that's where maybe having like landmarking and things like that can be really useful in a maze. So like if it's a hedge maze or something like that, you might want like some target that they have at the center of the maze so that they can tell they're making progress towards the center. You might want to have some way that like they put down a breadcrumb or something like that as they walk to show that, okay, I've already gone down this side and I know there's nothing down there. I'm going to now go in a different direction. So again, generally avoid mazes. If you're using them, make sure you're like landmarking and things like that and making it really clear to the player what's going on. And yeah, like level design as well is a thing that can evolve and change over time. So this is Thief 2 from 2000 and this is Thief from 2014. And there's an article there in G&D Tech just about the kind of how level design has changed. And there's pros and cons to this. Like if you look at the 2014 game, it's a much more straightforward path through the game, where the 2000 game is kind of a much more dense space with kind of maybe more things to do inside there. Um, neither is necessarily good or bad. It depends on the game and the experience you're trying to create. So just bear in mind that you might want to think about the layout and design of your levels as to like how linear is it versus how open-ended, and how much like opportunity is there for kind of random things to occur and pop up. So then the last sort of key area is, once we move past thinking about like tutorials and creating the spaces, sometimes we want to just guide the player as well. So in this image from Bioshock 3, we can see like if you walk into this room, there's really only one area you're really going to want to go to, and that's this area behind the statue. And it creates this very like compelling, striking image that you kind of look at and you go, oh cool, I want to head past there to see what's going on. And even like the danger do not approach the specimen and stuff like that, it all, because of the type game this is, it encourages you into that space. It kind of encourages the player to kind of challenge that, oh wow, I'm dangerous, so I'm going to go in there and see what can happen. And that scene there is very much like there's a lot going on in terms of composition. So try to think of framing and composition of your scene. How do you showcase your level and frame the scene using the player's perspective? Like, how do you make sure the player can kind of see what's going on and see it quite effectively? Try and showcase the goal or where you want the player to go. So this is another thing. Like, I even have this with major project students this semester, where like in one of their levels, you did start like looking at a wall in front of you, and the idea was that the wall had an arrow painted to the right, that you would then do a U-turn and walk up the stairs that are behind you, basically. And like, there's no reason to do something like that. If you're doing something like that, you want the player to walk up the stairs at the start of the scene. Start the player looking up the stairs so that they're framed with like, oh, cool, there's a stairs there. That's obviously where I'm meant to go. There's stuff up there. So again, showing the player what they're trying to do. And you can use color, texture, lighting to show like the paths and stuff like that. Try and be consistent. So one thing you'll often see is like if you're creating a kind of open world-ish game, areas that like are kind of fast to travel on or something like that, you might have like a rocky ground texture or like a sort of sorry. You might have a sort of like pebbly type ground texture that shows grass and stuff on the ground, and then some little rocks and stuff. And that means that that's like a smooth path that you can follow, and it will lead maybe between like towns or villages or like kind of homesteads, whatever it might be. And then there might be areas with overgrown grass, and that just means they're fields. They might not lead anywhere, but you can walk through them if you want. And that's using like the color and texture to show those sort of areas. You'll often see as well in games, like 9 times out of 10, if you're playing a game and it's like very level design focused, if you're wondering where to go next, look for like the best lit area in the scene, and that's generally where it wants you to go next. Okay, it generally highlights, go here, it's lit up this area, so you should go there and see what happens. And what happens there is the player basically learns the language of the game just by playing. So in terms of lighting, a good tip is the moon is actually a really good source, especially if you're doing like a night level. The moon is like a really nice, it gives a really nice sort of light source. And again, as I mentioned, like if you were doing, let's say, a maze game or something like that, having the moon can actually be a useful landmark because it can kind of show you maybe in relation to this maze, where is the moon or what sort of direction are you going in? And it might help kind of landmark that for players as well. And it can also serve just as a broader landmark of, oh, I'm heading over to that castle towards the moon, basically. And then using lighting as well to guide the player. So you use darkness to reward exploration. So if you want a player to go somewhere, you use lightness and tell them to go there. But it's often a good idea, and level designers often do this too, like in the dark corners of a game, like to hide maybe a chest with a cool item in it or something like that, or just maybe some additional resources or something like that. So you guide the player to somewhere with light, but you reward them for exploring that area with maybe a hidden chest that's kind of hidden in the shadows of that area. And again, that's the sort of language of level design where you're trying to entice players to areas and then encourage them for exploring. So again, that's the sort of thing of like the encouraging the player to explore with breadcrumbs and rewards, hide things in dark, like lead them nearby. Using the lighting and landmarking to guide the player is quite important. So again, guiding the player through the space and encouraging them to explore when you want them to explore, you can use like lighting and landmarks and stuff like that. If you find the players going the wrong way in playtests and they're not finding the door that you think is really clear, if you use lighting, generally is kind of one of the key ways you can guide them to that door. But, you might do lighting, you might change the texture of it to make it clearer it's there. There's a lot of things you can do, but like listen to your play testers. If your players aren't going where you think they should be going, it's generally an issue with the level design. It's almost never an issue with the players themselves. So that hopefully like is a good rundown of some of the nuts and bolts kind of key principles of level design that should help with the design of spaces and thinking about like what are good ways to design spaces. So if there are any questions, please let me know.